Welcome to In Focus with Ejaz Haider. The U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan is complete. That country has to work out a political settlement on its own now, with facilitation from external actors, but the primary responsibility now lies with Afghans themselves. Taliban are in control of Kabul and most other parts of Afghanistan except Panjshir and some districts in Baghlan. Whether that gets resolved through use of force or negotiations will be important. Equally, the resilience of the movement notwithstanding, three big issues loom large on the horizon: stabilization, international recognition, and money. All three are interrelated and vital for the next challenge, which is governance. Stabilization requires constitutional compact that is broad-based and acceptable to all the stakeholders and spells out women and other rights clearly. Important though such a compact is, it is likely to collide with the Taliban ideology. Last time round, the central tenets of that ideology were considered non-negotiable. We will have to wait and see how it works out this time round. With that are linked the two issues of money and international recognition. There is no money in Afghanistan. According to Ajmal Ahmadi, former governor of Afghanistan's central bank, with the freezing of $9 billion of foreign reserves, import coverage has dropped from more than 15 months to only 2 days overnight. International aid flows are likewise expected to decline. Germany has already announced a suspension of $300 million in aid, while the IMF has suspended its $440 million in SDR allocation. This has created inflation. The currency value has declined. Food prices have trebled. Essential food items and medical supplies are witnessing acute shortages. Skilled human resource has left, is leaving, or wants to leave. The United Nations has already warned of a humanitarian crisis. All this, unfortunately, is in addition to continuing violence. What should we expect in the coming days and months? To discuss this, I'm joined by Neda Balochi, a postdoctoral assistant professor of Middle Eastern Studies at Rutgers, Dr. Carl Kaltenthaler, professor of political science at the University of Akron, and Saifatullah Safi, an Afghan journalist who has worked for years with international media. Thank you so much. Let me begin with Mr. Safi here, who has his nose to the ground, who has been watching this unfold for a very long time. Mr. Safi, how do you look at the, for the moment, leaving aside other things, the basic humanitarian crisis that seems to be unfolding?
The international withdrawal, especially the U.S. forces withdrawal from Afghanistan, was expected since years or maybe months, but that was not expected the way that they withdrew from Afghanistan, at least after the collapse of the Dr. Ashraf Ghani's government. So the nature of withdrawal has been and the control of Taliban of more territory. I mean, especially the Kabul, and the absence of peaceful transitional of power has, I think, has caused many negative aspects of the Afghan issue. I mean, what happened are happening now, or we are witnessing on the ground. There is absence of government. Afghanistan is the only country in the world that there is no government has been formed till now. Since 2 weeks, the Taliban already announced their control, military control, but the political body to control or to run the country's institution has been fully has been not formed till yet. There is the economy has been fall, and the banks has been closed till now, and it will close. Instead, the Taliban are trying to open some of or pushing the banks to be to open again. But the problem that we are facing now, that thousands has been fled their homes. The uncertainty is, I think, that's more than 2 weeks before. So thousands of Afghans, they has been outside Afghanistan or the borders of the neighboring countries. So it means that Afghanistan is again in a crossroad. If
I believe camps have also set up in and around Kabul, where people from other provinces and districts have come, leaving their homes and belongings back there, and they are basically dependent on international charities for food and other basic amenities. Is that correct?
No, that's not correct, because the international presence in Afghanistan after the Taliban control on Kabul has been reduced, and we cannot say on a zero level, but reduced. There is no international agencies now. They're transferred. They are more headquarters to the neighboring countries, or maybe they are waiting the situation, because there is a very, very uncertainty of security situation in Kabul. Till now, the Taliban has not formed the government. They are out, and the whole institution, security institution has been collapsed totally. So that's why in such a environment, that will be very difficult for the international organization to continue their functioning in Afghanistan, especially in Kabul.
So one of the important things that they need to do is to essentially be able to form a government. And I was talking to Ahmed Wali Masood, who had arrived in Paris from Pakistan, and he was of the view that the Transition Council with Hekmatyar, former President Karzai, and Dr. Abdullah talking to the Taliban is not really a framework in and through which all stakeholders are represented. So they'll have to move to some framework which can then involve other stakeholders. But Dr. Nida Balochi, I believe you have been working with some organizations that have been trying to ameliorate the situation on the ground. So give us a sense of what's happening and what are the reports?
Thank you for having me back. Yes, I have been working largely to get out to Afghan women and families, and it has been nothing short of chaotic. From the State Department to The Hague to who all of their individuals who are working around the clock in order to sort of have met this August 31st deadline, it is nothing short of moment to moment. And we're all on computers and cell phones and trying to, and how it works is very literally contact with the person on the ground and the family on the ground, which means that cell phone batteries die, internet and sort of Wi-Fi has been cut in Afghanistan on and off. And there are passwords, and it has been very difficult to be moving from moment to moment, to wait for hours, to get a green light, to communicate then with the people on the ground in order to tell them somebody is coming to get them, to make sure that they're in exactly the place that they're supposed to be in, that they can be found. And so it is a lot of communicating and ups and downs. And then at the very last moment, we did have a couple actually who we were not even aware they were on an American list and another country's list. And once they were inside the gates, decided that they wanted to go not to the United States, but to another country. And that country's forces weren't answering the phone. And they were about to be sent back out the gates. In essence, that if, the other side, so for instance, the UK has also not been answering consistently. And so if you are working with other countries and other organizations who are representing other countries, if they don't have the technological means, or they're backed up, or they're just simply overwhelmed and just not answering, there is then the possibility that the people that you just spent 12 hours getting inside the gates are going to be sent back out. Thankfully, that didn't happen, but there are still thousands really who are outside the gates trying to get in. And now because the airport is closed, the U.S. government has left, then you have heard about, and there is sort of organizations are trying to get allies and friends out from other countries, that they're using other countries, not only through land corridors, but other extraction means to get Afghans out. And it has become a more complicated process, significantly much more complicated process and dangerous process. Some have already left Kabul. So it makes communication more difficult, as well as coordination. Right. So it, in short, it has been nothing but chaotic. It has been very chaotic.
It's an understatement, frankly. And fortunately, Pakistan, the government of Pakistan and the Pakistan mission in Kabul have been working round the clock and evacuating a number of foreigners, civilians, as well as military personnel. Dr. Carlton-Theller, the interesting question would be that the U.S. and its allies would likely, as they already have implied, set up some litmus tests with reference to not just recognition, but also the release of monies, in terms of aid and also foreign exchange. Now, it's already taking time for Afghanistan to have a government. Do you think that in the interim, there is need for some kind of aid in order to basically address the plight of the commoners who are now facing the prospect of having no money, no food, no medicines, and the rest of it?
Well, the United States government's in a very difficult position right now. It would definitely want to get aid to the Afghan people because it's very clear there's major suffering going on now, and it'll only get worse. The Afghan economy is on a precipice and is very likely to collapse fully very soon. 70+% of the funds that come from the Afghan government are aid. 40% of the GDP, that's basically gone now.
Yeah.
Having said that, there are some things that really stand in the way of the United States getting aid through the Taliban to the Afghan people. Part of it, and this is what gets a lot of media attention in the United States, is how the Taliban would treat women, how the Taliban would deal with education for girls, general human rights types of things like that. But one of the things that's kind of glaringly missing from the discussion in the U.S. media is the Taliban's relationship with al-Qaeda. And the Taliban and al-Qaeda are still very closely linked. And that will be something that we brought up in Congress in discussions about what kind of relationship to have with the Taliban. It'll make it very difficult to kind of normalize relations between the United States government and the Taliban.
Right. That is obviously an issue of concern, but statements from the Taliban as well as some U.S. officials indicate that, frankly, at this point, they are, the Taliban have given commitments and the U.S. seems okay with those commitments. As a matter of fact, even with reference to evacuations, the U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said to the media, and I think this was about 3 days ago, and he said that we will be able to bring more people out of Afghanistan because the Taliban, we are in contact with the Taliban and they've given us commitments. At the same time, the Taliban have also been saying to Afghans that, look, those of you who are skilled people should stay back and help rebuild the country. Now, the issue, Dr. Carlton-Theller, it becomes a catch-22. Because if the U.S. and its allies, as I said earlier, are going to basically look at the results of what happens going forward, then the problem on the ground for the people continues to grow. And that then becomes a vicious cycle. Someone at some point has to address that. Do you think that bringing in the United Nations in some way could perhaps facilitate that process?
Bringing in the United Nations could theoretically help with this situation, but the problem is that you've got a division in the Security Council between the United States, the UK and France on one side, and then the Russians and the Chinese on the other. It's very clear that the Russians and the Chinese want to have a good relationship with the Taliban. The Chinese, I think, are actually lining up to help with aid in Afghanistan. So this will become, unfortunately, part of great power competition. And I think the Afghan population will suffer because of this. This will be viewed through the lens of the United States potentially competing with China and Russia, and that complicates the thing even more. So, you got on one side the Taliban in their relationship with Al Qaeda. The other side, you've got the Taliban in their relationship with the Chinese and the Russians. So we'll see how this plays out.
It's interesting that you say this. Let me just quote from this op-ed that Ajmal Ahmadi wrote for Financial Times. This was last week. And he says, and I quote, the assertion that China, Russia, or even Pakistan will invest large sums in Afghanistan is not realistic. In 2019, as Afghanistan's Minister of Commerce, I attended the Second Belt and Road Initiative conference in Beijing. However much we tried, Afghanistan was never part of the BRI, and I would not expect it to be a part of the initiative in the near future. And then he went on to say, even if such investments were to occur, they cannot replace the combined financial firepower of the main bilateral and multilateral donor agencies. So it seems to me that someone who has dealt with Afghanistan's economy and trade and commerce seems to think that the Western world still owes some kind of framework in and through which they can help Afghanistan. And this is regardless of the formation of the government or the nature of that government. Now, from what you have just said, with reference to great power rivalry, as also other factors, it seems to me that that's probably not going to happen.
I'm not optimistic, to be honest, that the Afghan people will get a lot of aid from the West. And that's not even saying, well, I don't believe the Taliban have changed their stripes or that kind of thing. I think there's so many political reasons and so much political pressure within their own governments to say, look, this is a regime that came to power by force. It never participated in elections. How can you say this is a legitimate regime? This is a group that has harbored terrorists. It will just be extremely difficult to kind of normalize relations.
So there's going to be a throwback to the old categories and sort of narrative. But thank you so much. That was Dr. Carlton Teller speaking with us. Neda Balochi, this doesn't seem to be a rosy picture by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, it seems to me that at the end of the day, the common Afghans are going to be caught in this the crossfire of various other factors, if I were to mix metaphors, and that means further problems for them.
Absolutely. The complications are going to be ongoing. One thing I would point out about the Financial Times editorial is that was during President Ghani's position in Afghanistan. So the BRI initiative may not have had the inroads in Afghanistan that the Chinese may have sought, because Afghanistan at that time was so tightly associated with the United States and its allies. Now that the U.S. has left, it is in a much more precarious situation. And so what we should be looking at is not only sort of aid and the money that was going to be coming from the IMF and these different international organizations, but the threat of sanctions and how this might, in fact, because it's estimated that Afghanistan is sitting on over $1 trillion worth of minerals, may in fact be the moment that some outlays are made for the BRI initiative. Nevertheless, to your point, regardless of whether or not this happens, we can see sanctions on the horizon if the Western governments and those U.S. allies aligned with NATO decide to keep withholding aid and that money. As we've been talking about the numbers, you've got over 50% who are relying on aid I think 30 to 40% of the Afghan population were being paid by international organizations. So
Yes.
all in total, we're looking at about 80% that were reliant on external funds. So yes, the future does not look very good, and quite bleak. And it's a very difficult political situation to have to think through. Really, how do you develop a policy and a strategy, and can you that will alleviate some of the suffering that is impending?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Neda Bolochi, speaking with us. Mr. Saifi, this is not a good situation at all. Do you think that this could actually compel all the stakeholders, not just the Taliban, but others also, to come together and work out a government so that the international community can come to the aid of Afghanistan? Do you think it's optimistic to think that way, or do you think it's not going to happen?
Yeah, for us, and as an Afghans, there is an immediate need that the situation must change, and change quickly, especially in light of the worsening situation or the humanitarian crisis that we are facing now. So the Taliban, that they are now in charge of the Afghans' territory. I mean, they has that opportunity to bring the country to a new start or a new beginning, true one, to engage with the international community, and because without that, the situation will get worse, I think. And secondly, to try honestly working with other Afghans to form as soon as possible the inclusive government, which will represent all Afghans and the minorities.
I think that's probably the most important thing right now. But that's also something that no one is sure about, Mr. Saifi.
Yeah. On the other hand, the international community also have that responsibility, especially moral responsibility. Western countries, that they were here for 2 decades and they left with the way that they left, we have seen. So they have that responsibility to engage diplomatically, politically, and to push for a future that will inclusive for all Afghans, that will prevent country to return back to a place threaten the regional, national, and international security. So that's possible through that platform. Also, there is a measure and a great responsibility on the neighboring country, especially Pakistan, which now enjoying a special relation or a special relation with Taliban. There is a positive signs. There is a communication has been adopted with all sides. So some of the Afghan leaders, they were in Islamabad, and we expect finally that this is opportunity for the international withdrawal was a challenge for the future of this country, but especially this in same time the opportunity for Afghans as well for the region. We can start through supporting the Afghan peace process.
Frankly, Saifi, that's what Pakistan has been doing. As you know, the Pakistani foreign minister was on a 4-nation tour. Pakistan has been trying to create a regional consensus, been trying to help in whatever way one possibly can, but you'd agree that this is a very difficult situation. But thank you so much. That was Saifatullah Saifi speaking with us. I am also joined by Samir Pasha, who's a lawyer specializing in extradition, human rights, and criminal law. Ms. Pasha, thank you for being on the program. We were just talking about the unfolding humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan. As you know, the UN has already flagged it. And we're just discussing the problem that the US and its Western allies are going to, have these boxes checked before they release monies. And so, Afghanistan is in a catch-22.
First of all, I just wanted to make a comment on the previous analyst's kind of comments, I would like to point out that Pakistan has had a very successful, and it's been highly complimented by the UNHCR, a smart ID card program where over 1.4 million Afghan refugees have been registered. And that's part of the United Nations humanitarian council's kind of, drive to try and register as many people. And Pakistan has been at full and front line of doing that. The second thing is that, it's not just been a debacle, it's actually been a catastrophe. And the sad reality is that UK and a lot of most of the coalition forces, they have, shown great immaturity in the way they went in. And now what we are seeing is great immaturity on the way out. They have departed, leaving a great power vacuum. A vacuum that will no doubt be filled by violence and eventually the Taliban. But I'm focusing more on, where does the moral responsibility lie with the UK? Now, the UK has made many claims in the last 2 weeks that we will stand by our Afghan brothers and sisters. We will not leave them behind, except for the fact that none of this has actually come into fruition. The immigration system and status for refugees fleeing is complex. The UK government has promised to set up a displaced person or a vulnerable person scheme for Afghans, much like they had done for the Syrian refugees. That is yet to actually start and go live. There are still, basic blunders being made where there is a complete lack of common sense. And I just want to give you just one quick example of that. One Afghan interpreter wanted to bring his family over into the UK. He had, after 5 years, managed to get his refugee status. And that's 5 years asking the Ministry of Defense. Once the Ministry of Defense accepted that his family could join, they said, well, your family has a biometrics appointment and they must go to Kabul to do it. Well, how can they do that? The whole point is the fact that they can't. So there is a lack of joined up thinking. There is complete displacement and immaturity on behalf of the Home Office and the UK government, and indeed most of its kind of allies, in how to actually come true on the words that they have said. They said a lot of big things when they went in. None of that was achievable. At least they should do the honorable thing now and leave and do the words that they are now saying upon their departure.
Well, frankly, there were discerning their own diplomats as far back as 2008. Some of their military officers also said that this is not going anywhere. But obviously no one was prepared to listen to them at that time. But you made some excellent points, Mr. Pasha. Give me a sense of, before I close, give me a sense of whether this entire sort of chaotic way of handling this situation is likely to get streamlined, or as far as when I read the UK media, it doesn't seem to be really enamored of the Prime Minister's ability to do certain things. So is this likely to happen, or is it going to remain chaotic?
Definitely, I don't want to be the bearer of bad news, but I think this will be a trial and error. And by the time the UK government finds a solution or a system which can streamline and start to actually include people who are the most vulnerable and at risk, I think it will be too late. There has never been joined up thinking from the Home Office, not just in relation to Afghan or refugee or Syrian refugees, but also, if you look at the kind of Windrush generation, they have done the exact same thing.
Yeah, well, yes, I would agree with you. Unfortunately, I wish it hadn't come to this pass, but thank you so much, That was Samir Pasha speaking with us. We shall take a short break and return to discuss the meeting between Israel's Defense Minister Benny Gantz and Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas for the first time in years. Stay with us. Welcome back to In Focus. Israel's Defense Minister Benny Gantz has met Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas for the first time in years. After a near-complete breakdown in relations between the two sides, the Sunday evening meeting in Ramallah came just days after U.S. President Joe Biden asked Israel's far-right new Prime Minister to try to improve the lives of Palestinians. Meanwhile, a source close to Naftali Bennett said he had approved the meeting, but, and this is a quote from what the source said, there is no peace process with the Palestinians, nor will there be. This was about issues between the defense establishment and the Palestinian Authority. Observers, however, believe that Israel will use this to create further divisions between Fatah and Hamas. The latter, a hardline group, controls Gaza. To discuss this further, I'm joined by Kamil Hawash, a professor of engineering and a Palestinian intellectual, and Alan Eby, a research fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute. Thank you to both my panelists. Let me begin with Professor Hawash here. Professor Hawash, some of the reports suggested that this meeting is very significant. What exactly is the significance, if at all, of this meeting?
I think it is significant, but probably not in the way that some people will quote it as a sort of breakthrough meeting between the Palestinians and the Israelis. I think it is effectively normalizing the status quo by Israel saying this is not about discussion about finding peace with the Palestinian people. It is about normalizing the occupation, normalizing security cooperation. And for that, we have to take some measures. It's like an equation. How much economic prosperity should the Palestinians have in order for there to be quiet and therefore for Israel to continue to expand its settlements and to Judaize Jerusalem, to continue with the siege on Gaza. So they're looking for ways to protect effectively the Palestinian Authority from collapse. Because at the moment, in the way it operates and the work of the security forces is what Israel needs to maintain its security. So I think that's the significance of it. Abbas agreed to meet not the Prime Minister of Israel, but agreed to meet the Minister of War, as the Palestinians call him, the Defense Minister Benny Gantz, who very proudly, when he stood for election in the first or second election to the Knesset, produced a video which emphasized how hard he was on the people of Gaza in 2014, when so many Palestinians were killed and injured and so much destruction was heaped on the Palestinians. So I fear that is the significance. It is not a return to serious negotiations about finding peace between the two sides. It is about Israel feeling that it can extract the security cooperation it needs by giving some economic advance. I don't want to call it prosperity in the lives of Palestinians.
Yeah, that's where the $150 that have been, the figure that has been thrown around. But Professor Hawash, quickly, a follow-up question before I go to Mr. Eby. When you say normalizing the occupation, are you suggesting, and correct me if I'm wrong, are you suggesting that this is actually a ploy whereby what is being constantly protested against is something that will slowly become acceptable?
Well, that's what they hope, because when I say normalizing the occupation, an occupation by implication needs to end. Now, if the discussions are about how to maintain quiet while that occupation continues and the settlements expand, then in my view, that's normalizing it. And by Abbas accepting that the discussions are not about ending the occupation, about ending the siege on Gaza, ending the Judaization of Jerusalem, and moving towards the end of this military occupation, which has lasted for over 50 years, then it is about, he's sort of almost accepting that all that is needed is to maintain the very low levels of the economy in the West Bank, particularly for the people not to rise against the PA, and therefore the PA might collapse. And I think that's really what I mean by normalizing the occupation,
right.
In that, in terms of hope for Palestinians, the hope would be that they get their salaries rather than for the occupation to end.
Okay. Let me pull in Mr. Abbey here. Mr. Abbey, you heard what Professor Hawash has said. Is there any possibility under this government? There was obviously no possibility under the previous Prime Minister, and this one has been his protege and apparently is even more hardline on the issue of settlements and non-acceptance of a two-state solution. So what is your sense of this meeting and exactly what it is that Israel seeks to achieve from this?
Well, I think some of what the professor said has value. It does, in fact, retain stability in the West Bank, and unfortunately, that does mean a difficult situation for the average Palestinian, if there was such a thing. It keeps Abu Mazen in power, which seems to be his only real desire. And it keeps quiet among the Israeli public. It does not really help the average Palestinian other than those who get Fatah salaries, because the Arab world has severely cut its funding. And it's ironic, of course, that Israel is going to be funding the PA. It isn't a step toward peace in that neither Abbas nor the Israeli government are in positions to move forward in that regard. Neither has popular support for such a deal. Neither does the Abbas leadership have the public support of its own people. That said, one could say that anything that makes right-wing Israelis and Hamas unhappy is not a bad thing and could be a good thing in the short term, but it is simply a procedural thing. However, let's not forget that this did come right after Bennett met with President Biden, and President Biden is pushing for some developments, and Bennett did approve this meeting by Defense Minister Gantz. And it is the first time there's been a face-to-face meeting in Ramallah between an Israeli official, a top Israeli official in the government and Palestinian Authority leadership in more than a decade. So in that sense, it's a small step, but it is a big step.
Okay, Mr. Abbey. So you've explained Mahmoud Abbas's position and obviously his lack of popularity. But then you also have Hamas. Now, Hamas is an entity with which Israel doesn't want to talk, neither does the United States. Hamas also is an entity with popular support. So what exactly is the way out of this problem? Because I'm assuming, I don't know about your position on this, but I'm assuming that there are lots of Israelis who do believe that, somehow this conflict should come to an end with some kind of reasonable agreement between Israel and Palestine.
Well, I think in the near term, with the current leadership on both sides not having a great deal of room to move, some small steps can be taken, some economic steps can be taken. It may be trickle-down economics from the top, but it is something, and when something is better than nothing. At the same time, it is ironic that the United States and Israel don't want to talk to Hamas, but of course the United States is now talking and doing business with the Taliban. So who is the worst player here? I'm not saying that Hamas are good guys. I do think that it is in the long-term interest of Israel, and I suspect there are some under-the-table conversations, but it is in the long-term interest of Israel to deal with all Palestinian entities, because that's the only way a solution will be resolved. To continue propping up the unpopular Abu Mazen government is not a long-term strategy. Unfortunately, politicians in all countries don't have long-term strategies, while it does seem as if ideologically determined groups, terrorists, or however you would call them, such as Taliban and Hamas, do have long-term strategies. And And frankly, it would be worthwhile for governments to begin to take long-term views that aren't limited by terms of office. That doesn't mean that we should give up democratic months in elections. I do think, though, democracy needs to begin to think in a more long-term way.
Okay. Professor Hawash, before I close this segment, any thoughts with reference to what Alan Eby has said?
Yeah, no, I mean, after the last round of fighting between Israel and Hamas, I called for the world to talk to Hamas, because you cannot ignore what Hamas achieves in terms of the stability of both the Israeli and the Palestinian side. And to say that they will not talk to them, I mean, there was some sort of comparison between Taliban and Hamas. I know it wasn't exact, but the point is you have to deal with your enemy. And by that time, you don't just meet with them militarily. Anyone who followed what happened in May will recognize that even under this long-term siege, Hamas was able to develop rockets that went further and were more accurate. So you have to question whether there is a need for this siege. Wouldn't it be better to actually sit down with all Palestinian sides and find a way to an agreement? But the fact is, Israel doesn't want that. Bennett is against the Palestinian state, as was Netanyahu. What the Israelis think is long-term, the longer that they can find protection and cover from the international community to expand settlements, to extend the sort of presence of Israelis in the West Bank, the more there is the reality of that existence. But they will not have peace. That can be guaranteed. Peace will only come when there is respect for the Palestinians and for their rights, and there is a genuine move towards implementing it. Because what the Israelis miss is the fact that the longer this goes on, the more the Palestinians will demand a return and the freedom for Palestinians in every part of historic Palestine, and that's when they say we shouldn't be talking about that. We should be talking about giving Palestinians some rights. And if Abbas said to the Israelis, "I will not meet anyone unless we go back to negotiations based on the international, from his point of view, international law," there will be no talks. That would have worried the Israelis more. This is why I say this is normalization of the occupation, because what he's effectively said is all we need is an improvement in the economy, but that will not deliver peace.
Right. I suspect we'll be revisiting these issues again also, but for the time being, thank you to Professor Kamal Hawash, thank you to Mr. Alan Eby for his insights. This is all from In Focus this evening. We shall see you tomorrow at the same time. Keep following our latest updates on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.